Uh, I've got to tell you that I've been this is my 8th year at BKSM, so I've heard Bishop Barker a number of times now. Every time it's fresh, every time I learn. You're in for a really big treat tonight. So let us invoke the Spirit on our time together. And without any further ado, please, Bishop, take over.
Thanks, Dean Don. And it's great to see you all. I am really appreciative for your willingness to come out tonight. Let's start with a prayer, and then I'll try to say a little bit by way of introduction and hopes for the evening. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving God, thanks for setting us in the midst of this Advent season and filling our hearts with expectation and hope, waiting and preparation, joy and wonder. Help it to be true that even as we're readying ourselves for the coming of Jesus anew into our lives, we're increasingly open to the call you place on us, the kingdom you have us help to build, the wonder of our assembled church communities and your presence in them, one and all. As Dean Don said, let your Spirit flow through us tonight and unite us even across these many miles, and fill us with an awareness of her presence as we gather in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm making one huge disclaimer, which is that I'm home alone tonight and I don't have anybody to watch my 2 very bad dogs. So if they start misbehaving, I'll just try to tend to them quickly. Probably I'll mute myself and run away. Don't panic. I'm sure all will be well. I want to start with a couple of thank yous. First to Dean Don and the larger staff of BKSM, Fran tonight, Casey, the board, and all of your teachers. I am just so impressed by and increasingly moved by this ministry. It's just far exceeded my hopes and expectations when Nebraska was invited to be part of this project those many years ago. And it's become absolutely critical to the foundation of preparation for ministry that we offer here in this diocese, as I know it is in all of yours. I just feel like we punch way above our weight in terms of what we offer by way of formation. And it comes at some cost to those who are helping to run this program, who work really hard on our behalf. So I would really be remiss if I didn't say thank you in front of this assembled group for the ministry of Don and the rest of the staff and all those who labor to make this school so special. I think it's changed not only the lives of the students who've moved through, but the landscape of the church in this part of the country in ways that it would be really hard to measure. You're having a profound impact. And I really want to thank all of you on the call tonight for responding to God's call in your lives, for your willingness to do the hard work of being part of preparation that for lots of you comes at the cost of driving great distances or being part of a virtual community that's occasionally a little wonky. I know it's not perfect, but I also trust, because of the testimony I hear from Nebraskans who've been part of BKSM and come back as graduates and now ordinands, that it really is just exceptional preparation for ministry. But again, I know it's not easy, and I just want to commend you for all that you pour into being part of this community. I want to additionally preface by noting that you're all entering ordained ministry at a really challenging time in the life of the church. We really need you. The challenges that we face are quite extraordinary, including the cultural tides that are moving all around us and are responsible in part for church participation getting smaller and smaller. But there are also challenges that are cultural, like the political divide that's such a part of the communities we live in here in this part of the country, global climate change, which increasingly ought to sober us and, if not panic us, into taking more serious action as advocates and ministers, and just so many other things. And I have to tell you, I have extraordinary hope for this moment, because I do feel like what's happening is that the church is being, maybe the biblical image is winnowed, maybe it's purified, but I feel like what's happening is, while we may be smaller as some of these tides toss us about, the disciples who remain are people with really great commitment and serious faith in the person of Jesus and hope for the church. And I feel like in Nebraska, where I serve mostly small churches, which I think would be real familiar to most everybody on this call tonight, those are still communities that are incredibly meaningful and life-giving, not only to their members, but to the little towns in which they live and work and serve. So it's good. It's a hard time that's on the near horizon for all of us who are called to ordained ministry, but I think it's a time of great consequence, and I really believe we can make a difference with God's help. And finally, by way of introduction, I want to say that it's, ordained ministry is always sacrificial. I'm sure that you have all at this point read the ordinals to the ministries to which you're called, whether priestly or diaconal, and are beginning to internalize some of the promises and vows that you'll be asked to make on the days of your ordinations. But for every order of ministry, including lay ministry, taking up the cross means really sacrificial living and ministry. And in a challenging time like this, where the sacrifices are perhaps amplified as compared to other times, it means that it's even harder work. It's still work in which you can take wonderful satisfaction and real joy. But the truth, beloved, is that sacrifice always hurts. It's not easy. That is the truth of sacrifice by definition. So when you hear you're going to be invited into a sacrificial ministry and you're reminded that following Jesus is at times about taking up the cross, it's important to remember that that's going to be hard, those kinds of moments. Now, I think we always have a choice about that. I think that's just good theology. Jesus comes to save us from trouble that's foisted upon us by outside and evil forces. When it comes to the sacrifice of taking up the cross, we get to decide where to do that in our lives. But where you make that hard decision, it's going to be difficult. And I think it's important to be sober and ready for that as you're stepping into ordained ministry in years to come. Okay, so tonight I want to talk about what falls through the cracks. I'm guessing because I have never been through the program at BKSM, but on the basis of tons of conversation with graduates about things they wish they'd had a little more of, lots of conversations about things they loved and would have loved to explore more deeply, and occasionally conversations or interactions with folks who got a little off track or in a little trouble because they missed a thing. I'm going to try to make some educated guesses about things that often are about things like etiquette and some of the church norms that aren't easily taught in textbooks or in lectures, but often come from deep formation that is a little more easily acquired in the immersive experience of a 3-year residential seminary education as a priest would have it more traditionally than you all get in your somewhat truncated formation. So, and I want to order my thoughts with the acronym SWEEPS, which is one thing I'll offer to you, and I'll bet a lot of you have encountered this before, but SWEEPS. SWEEPS is a way to think of the whole palette of ministries that is offered by a healthy parish church. So the letters stand for service, worship, education, evangelism, pastoral care, and stewardship. And I think that's a pretty decent litany of the critical ministries that emanate from a healthy parish church. And so in each one of those little areas of focus, I'm going to offer a handful of ideas or reflections that I hope will help you along the way. I'll try to stop after every short section and see if you have any questions or ideas of your own. I really do hope to be interactive. If we finish early, great. I know you all got lots going on in your lives, but if we take up our whole time, that's fine too. So let's go. First of all, in the area of service, I think it's true that at least one piece of sort of signature service and outreach ministry is a critical piece of every parish church's identity. And larger churches, and some of you might be called to serve in larger churches in the months and years to come, might do bigger ministries or have a variety of ministries that they offer. But more typically, the Nebraska churches that I serve, more than half of them would be places where fewer than 25 people worship on a Sunday morning, and they're probably located in a really small town, and they don't have the kind of resources that they can run a whole big bunch of outreach and service ministries. And frequently, folks start to feel a little put upon and burn out, and that is a ball that's dropped. I really want to encourage you, as present lay leaders in the church and future ordained leaders in the church, not to drop the outreach and service piece just because it's difficult. It's a huge piece of identity for a church. If you can say, if your church in a small community has a reputation for doing a thing, just one thing, it can make it is a huge help in terms of community profile and evangelism. And also, and perhaps fundamentally, I should have led with this, but service is always about, for us, increasing the depth of our relationship with Jesus. He says explicitly, you will meet me, the real me, in person when you feed the hungry, when you house the homeless, when you visit those in prison. When you serve those people, you're serving me. When you're in relationship with those folks, you are in relationship with me. So it's a theological imperative for us to be serving folks on the margins. That's our inspiration and our mark. In terms of parish life, it's also just critical in terms of church identity. And I think small churches can do really amazing things, and I'll just enumerate a few that I know about that have happened here in Nebraska or in my own experience. And some of them are more hands-on than other. And I do think that actually being in relationship with the people that you're called to serve is the highest mark. That's the best thing. But any form of service and outreach is important for parish life and important for the people of God. So in no particular order, lots of you will have seen and maybe have churches who have a little free pantry out front. I think that's a great, low commitment way to start. Have somebody who's a little bit of a carpenter in your church, or you can now buy these things online. Build a little house with a door, put together a rota that folks can participate in to keep it stocked with simple, non-perishable foods like canned and boxed lunch items. Doesn't have to be fancy. You all know that food insecurity is a big deal right across our diocese, and especially in the level of poverty, hidden poverty in our rural areas can be really extreme. And where we have those little free pantries outside our churches, equally in the cities and our smallest towns, they're well received and get a lot of traffic. And that is a ministry that easily could be collaborative. It's not on the, necessarily the 6 or 10 people who are regular worshipers at our smallest churches to keep a pantry going. No, I would imagine most could manage that. But certainly you could be in touch with other neighbors or other churches who are nearby and get some additional support to help keep people fed. A couple other things are, we have a tiny church in Bassett, Nebraska, which is in north central Nebraska, beautiful little church, remote small town up on the South Dakota border in the Sandhills. And most years, the kind of famous bike ride for Nebraska passes through Bassett. And they do a feed for the massive number of people that come through the town every year on the bike ride. And it's just kind of a pancake supper after the fashion of a typical Shrove Tuesday pancake supper. But they feed an enormous number of people. And they just sort of lead it. Lots of other people from the small town help participate in purchasing and cooking and serving and cleaning up. But it really has become a fun signature thing for that church. In Valentine, where we have another tiny church, St. John's, a little further west, a little further north, very close to the Indian Reservation, they have the only food pantry in town. It's entirely staffed by volunteers from other churches. Our church provides the space because it's got a lot more building than it can use. And the personnel to open the church and sort of offer simple security and hospitality on pantry days, but other folks from other churches buy the food, inventory the food, arrange proper distributions, and do most of the interactive work with the guests. But without our underutilized building as the spot to house the pantry and welcome people on the weekly days that it's open, it wouldn't be happening. A number of our small churches have adopted refugee families for folks who are relocating to the U.S. from various spots. And that's lots of folks are relocating to Middle America, as you know, and that can be like whatever you can do in that regard can be really, really valuable and really life-changing for everybody involved. So I really commend that to you if it's a possibility. And then finally, I want to tell you, when I was a rector of a small church in New York, not New York City, tiny little town of 3,000 far from the city in the Hudson Valley for several years before I became Bishop of Nebraska. And we had a thrift shop that was the only thrift shop in the small town. That was an incredible outreach ministry. Everybody in the small town brought their cast-offs because there was nowhere else to take them. So we got tons of great donations from people all over town. The thrift shop was open every single Saturday, but it was only open Saturday. And it was only open for 3 hours from 9 to noon every Saturday. So and then the rest of the week, people would come in on various schedules and at their convenience and sort of sort through clothes and hang things nicely and clean things up and get ready for the next Saturday. I can't tell you how many people we served on a given Saturday, 100 easily, often more. We sold clothes at absolute rock bottom prices, comparable to Goodwill or better deals. Often we would just sell sacks of clothes and other small household items for $5. But because it was the only thing going in town, and over the years we had really developed some smarts about managing the inventory, knowing what people wanted, etc. The thrift shop contributed $40,000 a year to the church's budget, which in most small churches would be a total game changer, and it was for that little church. So, part of the reason I know it was success is it was always a ministry first. I mean, it wasn't about making the money. It was about providing a simple service to folks in need, and we were always beyond fair in terms of pricing and negotiating prices and all the rest. I'm positive the Holy Spirit blessed the thing because we went into it with the right attitude, and consequently made a lot of money for the church too. So those are some of my ideas about service in terms of outreach and that sort of mission from a parish church to a local community. And I'll stop, as I promised, and see if other people have fun ideas about service emanating directly from a parish church, or questions for me about that particular area of ministry.
So Bishop, I'm curious about, I'm part of the Western Diocese of Western Missouri. And I'm curious about your collaboration. You mentioned several instances where you were able to collaborate. And I'm curious how that got started and what you would, what strengths you would attribute to that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jody. And I don't, in some of those instances, I don't know. I really don't know how it turned out that in Valentine, we housed the thing and everybody else got involved. I would say, based on my own experience, that I think the secret to collaboration is to be genuine about a readiness to share completely in leadership. So if you present to the larger community a fait accompli in terms of this is the ministry we're going to do and this is how it's going to run and we just need you to help us do it, probably that won't fly great. But if you go in a posture more curiosity and hope, like, we know there are people who are underserved in this community, we think maybe it's about getting them food somehow, what can we do together? My guess is that if you're prayerful and honest in that kind of collaboration, something cool will happen. And it might turn out that the sort of the signature element of this thing doesn't emerge from that kind of collaboration. Maybe you go into it hoping that it'll be your church building that houses a thing, and that would raise your profile in the community. And it turns out that a church down the block that really wants to do this has a better facility. That's okay, of course, right? I mean, the key thing is to be in relationship with folks on the margins and to meaningfully serve people and to provide that opportunity for the people in our Episcopal churches. So if it turns out that the ELCA church down the block has a cooler, cleaner kitchen, it's not the end of the world if the cool thing gets to happen in their parish hall.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, or I'll go on to worship.
Lori has her hand raised.
Oh, thank you.
Just a quick one that our church started doing a couple of years ago is getting involved with the community's Veterans Day celebration. It's always observed in a park right across the street from our parish. And so a couple times it's been snowed out and things like that. So we offer our parish, that was before COVID. And we also, we really decorate it up. We make a small museum out of people's veterans from their families, well, I don't know what you call them, souvenirs or memorabilia. And then, like I said, we serve snacks and refreshments, and everybody is something that kind of puts us out in the community because it's in the paper every year, and we're on the list of contributors and that sort of thing. Not that that's that important, but and it's something our church community really gets into because we have a big Air Force base not too far from us. So
I think that's a perfect sort of organic example of this kind of thing, right? It's ministering to a community that's right there. It sounds like it's something people have interest in. I'm sure it brings people together out of a sense of patriotism and the rest. That's a great idea. And I can imagine you could leverage it to do more and more too. You could have a service for folks. Maybe you could provide services for veterans in time if you get to know them. There are all kinds of possibilities. Looks like Brittany put her hand up too.
This question may be in the vein of the conversation or might be better somewhere else, but what does it look like as you think of community outreach or being in presence in your area to cast vision as a leader and to collaborate with your vestry and collaborate with your parishioners who may not naturally feel inclined to reach out to their community? It might need some like pastoral help in connecting faith to society. I don't know how to ask that question. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it totally makes sense to me. I think that's a great question. It's sort of circling back to that sense that especially in our smallest churches, people feel like I can't do anymore. I don't know. I just can't do it. And I wouldn't know where to begin. And that sense of sort of hopelessness even. So I guess, certainly you lead by example. There's no question. So, and especially in a tiny church, I think if you, as a deacon or a priest, get involved in any kind of service work and are able to share stories about how that's life-giving to you and to continually put opportunities before other people, that is a way to like make incarnate whatever your sense of call and vision is about this kind of work. And in most instances, I would imagine that would be possible. You could get involved as an individual volunteer or leader, and in time add others to the mix. So that's one thing I think. I'm sure there are ways in which groundwork might need to be led, especially in some communities about this issue. Like it might start with Bible study and a certain amount of kind of re-immersion in the story of Jesus and some of his teachings, like the critical ones about how you meet him in person, really, truly, life-changingly, when you're in relationship by serving the poor and the outcast. Like, he teaches us a lot of hard and challenging things, and it's hard to remember it all. So one way to get people back in touch with that might be to reground folks in those portions of his stories and teachings so that they have a sense of commitment and inspiration there. And then I guess the last thing is I'm sure it's true for all of you that, participation in this kind of thing is often surprisingly transformative and really makes you feel good, right? Like that's the story of every mission trip there ever was. You go off thinking you're going to go help people, and it turns out that you're completely changed by the encounter, and you come back far more changed and helped than anybody you went to serve. And I think that happens to a lesser degree in any kind of meaningful service work where you really develop a deep Christian relationship with folks who you're intending to get to know more deeply. And so if you can just get people going, I think the likelihood that a momentum will build is a real thing.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So what about worship? I just have a few ideas. And I have worship in the sort of Sunday morning routine in my notes. And some of this is just kind of by way of advice and in no particular order. I think, first of all, that for deacons and priests both, inhabiting the sacred space of the church is a really principal calling. And it's your whole Sunday morning. You ought to be the first ones at the church building, and you ought to be the last ones to leave. There's a way in which the presence of the ordained person sort of hallows the space. You can be welcoming and hospitable to all comers if you're the first one in. I think for me personally, it became a part of my spirituality as a cleric to kind of enter the space when it was quiet and I was alone and I could pray and have a sense of being at peace before all the craziness of welcoming people and getting through whatever the schedule of the Sunday morning routine might be later in the day. So I would really urge you, even if you've got great shared leadership on the part of others who might want to do things like open the building or plug in the coffee pot, etc., it's still important for you to be there, to be present, to be welcoming, to be prayerful, start to finish, especially on Sunday mornings. A word of advice I would have about helping to grow a church and helping to enrich worship is to invite people to help lead worship. Here's some examples. No matter how small your town is, there's a high school, whether town or regional somewhere, that has a bunch of kids who play musical instruments. Invite high school kids to come enrich your church worship with some music. It could be any instrument or a group of instruments. It could be any level of musicianship. If it's just terrible grade school kids, people will love that their little lights were shining and they did their best. And if it's really excellent, sublime music by the best of the senior high kids, so much the better. That's a different kind of wonderful worship experience. In most small churches, it's pretty hard to have good, stable, really inspirational music. And we often get caught up trying to replicate the music of big churches that we simply can't without a choir and a really great organist and a choir or a congregation full of people who read music and love to sing. On the other hand, having a high school kid who can play the flute to come in and sit down and do a prelude before the worship from a Bach piece that they're learning for school anyway can really, really lift a worship service. So invite musicians of whatever sort from town. You can invite preachers too. Different bishops have different rules about this, and different rectors are going to have different tolerances, but you can certainly invite preachers, should be able to invite preachers from other denominations in town to get to know them, visiting Episcopalians, people from the bishop's staff I know want to get out and connect in meaningful ways. There are lots of charities who would love to come tell you about their work and would provide a really inspirational message as part of that. Storytellers, similarly, storytelling is such an ascendant hobby and movement all over the US and especially in the middle US. And it's one of the few things, along with music, that is absolutely appealing to all ages in a church setting and really brings everybody together. So if you can find somebody who can tell a story in the context of a worship service, great. Maybe somebody who has inspirational or even Christian stories appropriate to the setting. But if not, that can be a fun, all ages sort of formation or celebration event for before or after church that I would really commend to you. Similarly, I certainly have invited politicians to speak at every church I've ever served. They are dying to connect with churches and to get to know people, and usually they will come in a spirit of not like a stump speech or a campaigning, which probably isn't appropriate for a lot of church settings, but rather wanting to get to know people, hear about people's concerns. Lots of politicians are Christians, especially in this part of the country, and might appropriately offer to actually preach for you. But even if that doesn't work, it's a great adult ed time, and it's something to which folks from other parts of the community could be invited, especially if you get somebody like a state representative, somebody who's got a little bigger reach than, you know, the mayor of a small town. But I'm sure folks would be happy to hear from the mayor once a year too. I always invited people who had great voices to read. We would always do lessons and carols at every church I've ever served. And I would invite people from the community who either had some stature or who I knew had beautiful voices to read the readings on that night. So the mayor would come and read a reading, and some teacher who coached voice and who everybody knew had a beautiful voice would come read. Just a way to get through people through the doors who otherwise might not come visit church, and to connect the church folks with the larger community. Often, whether you're a deacon or a priest, people are going to, I'm changing topics, people are going to come to you during Sunday morning and ask for a thing. It's going to be, I have surgery on Wednesday, I could use your prayers. Or my mom's really in trouble, I could use your prayers. Or whatever it is, you either need to carry something with you to write things down, could be your phone if you're, you know, a little more technical, or just could be a notepad tucked in your pocket, but you really got to get it in the habit of writing it down. Or I think actually better, clearer boundaries, and I think arguably more pastoral is to say, please call me or send me an email when you get home. It's okay to put a little more responsibility on people. If it's really important, they'll get back to you. And then you can be fully present to everything else that's going on Sunday morning, trusting that folks will advocate for their own needs and drop you a quick line or a note when they get home from church, reminding you of whatever it was they needed from you. You can get awfully bogged down trying to receive that kind of information, remember it, and tend to it on the fly on Sunday morning. So I think it's important always to meet people pastorally with love and respect and care, but not to be hijacked from all the other things that you have to be present to, even in a very small community as an ordained leader on Sunday morning. And so figuring out how to either defer that work till later with people's help or keep track of it on Sunday morning so you can follow up later is key. I want to say that switching topics again, this is like popcorn. As a rule, use the Book of Common Prayer for worship on Sunday morning and don't depart from it, including the rubrics, which are part of the Book of Common Prayer. Every additive is somewhat problematic. And the reason is that the Book of Common Prayer is the repository of our theology. That is our theology. And every time we change a communion prayer because the language is prettier, every time we do a different dismissal because we're bored of the 3 that are offered in the prayer book, every time you change a collect for any reason, that has an impact on the church's theology. Now, I am a huge advocate for, among other things, inclusive language, equally about humankind and about the person of God. So there's some changes that are critical to make and that it's okay to make in my estimation. But when it comes to prayers from other Anglican tradition, like everybody loves the New Zealand prayer book, well, that is an entirely different part of the world, and that country's church labored over that thing for decades. It's theirs. It's not ours. Don't go there. Use those prayers on a retreat or in your personal spiritual life. But let the theology and the prayers of our Book of Common Prayer shape the people of God and form them in our beliefs and in uniting them in common prayer, and really make that your priority. I just think that's critical for us. And I have to tell you, you may get bored of those prayers as professionals, but your people are, they're not exposed to them in at all the same way that you are. And because of the seasonal changes and all the other richness of the prayer book, they're just fine. They're not looking for the innovation in nearly the same way that board priests and deacons are. So trust me, stick with the Book of Common Prayer. I want to say a word about worship persona. And I want to advise you to really trust that you can be yourself, be sincere, be down to earth. But there's one trap I really want to urge you all to avoid, and that's not to joke around. The temptation especially comes up when either if you're a person who uses humor all the time, or if you make a mistake, and we all do. That is not, the liturgy is better than that. This is about offering our very best to God. And there are places you can totally joke in a sermon appropriately. You can tell jokes at announcement time, and having a good sense of humor will help grow a church. But don't goof around during the sacred liturgies of the church. Bring your most sincere and reverent self to those moments. And again, you can still be yourself, by all means. A crazy stained glass voice that isn't really you is a peculiarity that a lot of clergy pick up, and it's not really helpful. I think people think it's weird. Use your voice, use yourself, but avoid the temptation of goofing around. Even if you make a mistake, you can apologize and move on with all the reverence you can. And then, if I may, one more thing about worship that's a total pet peeve is to keep a clean church and an orderly church. I see in churches of all sizes, but honestly and perplexingly, especially in our smallest churches, just an accretion of so much crap, like all this propaganda in the church narthex that's dusty and ancient and out of date, and all the accoutrement of worship, like every candlestick in the world somehow ends up in the sanctuary area, instead of like seasonally changing them in and out, and dusty old artificial flowers. It is true that any change you make to the worship space is risky, especially if you're newer to a community. You might not know why those particular artificial flowers ended up there, and they might be important. So I think it's good to be collaborative as you're moving things around in a worship space or cleaning it up. But it really says something that's unhelpful about what we believe is going on in worship and our sacred spaces if they're a mess, whether it's clutter or dirt. And it's a real common challenge in our churches, both large and small. And I would urge you to just take responsibility. Don't think somebody else is going to do that. That can be you. I can't tell you how many times I've run the vacuum up and down the center aisle of one of the churches I've served on a Sunday morning because something happened previously in the week that scattered flower petals or candle wax or sand or dirt, whatever. And I want the house of God to look great on a Sunday morning. I want people to be welcomed into a beautiful space, and that feels important to me. Again, it's a little pet peevey, but I'm just telling you the truth here. What ideas do you all have about worship or the Sunday morning routine, or questions for me? Okay, we can always circle back. Did I miss anybody?
Yeah, Pauline had her hand up.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, Pauline.
Yeah. Oh, no? Okay, sorry.
So let's talk a little bit about Christian education. Education is the next letter in the acronym SWEEPS. I think it's key to do one thing about Christian formation other than worship every Sunday morning. And again, I'm sort of orienting towards a small to medium-sized church, the likes of which I imagine most of you will end up serving, whether you're a deacon or a priest. One thing every Sunday morning. And I think it's always critical for the clergy to participate. You don't necessarily need to lead it, but you got to be present. That your Fanny at the table lends the thing weight and credibility. And if you're not there, people are going to wonder if it's really important or not. So one thing, and I think the ideal thing is a Bible study, and I'll say offer a couple of ideas about really easy ways to access that if that's not already happening in your church. But if that's not a fit for some reason, there are other ways to access the scriptures and be formed by them. And I think that's okay, not ideal, but I think it's okay. But equally, a book group, a conversation group, a prayer group, some kind of educational offering every Sunday morning adjacent to worship seems really important to me. And I also would urge you to be attuned to offering 1 or 2 special things a year, whether they're one-off, one-time events, or whether seasonal events, probably around Advent or Lent. None of that's too much, and especially in a small community, it can be a real game changer to offer people something besides worship around which to assemble and care for one another and to be formed by. 2 simple ways to do Bible study, but probably all of you will know these 2 resources, but I really believe in them. One is the Serendipity Bible, which has been in print for a long time now, and it's offered in various translations and for various groups. There's a Serendipity Bible for teens, and there's one for, women and men's groups, but it's a Bible that's laid out with margin notes that are keyed to every major pericope, every little story or passage. And the notes are set for small groups that are self-led and don't have a leader who necessarily knows a lot about the Bible. And there's always an intro question that's kind of a fun community building question that draws people into the conversation and helps them feel comfortable. And then there are questions that have to do usually with sort of personal life and faith journeys. And then there's some questions that ask you to apply what you've just read to your life. Again, it's not a perfect resource. It can be a little flat-footed, a little ham-handed. Sometimes the theology's a teeny bit wonky for me, but it's super accessible. And if you look ahead of time, since we have a lectionary and 3 or 4 passages from the Bible that you might look at on any given Sunday, you can pick the passage that has the best stuff in the serendipity from that day and just go ahead and study that passage if you wish. That's one I would commend to you. Another way to handle a simple sort of self-organized Bible study is to get the 1-volume Harper's Commentary of the Bible, which is a very renowned, constantly updated, scholarly Bible commentary that's quite succinct. And you can just you can start a Bible study by reading the Harper's synopsis of the passages you're going to look at. So you've had a word from the experts who will tell you what to look for and will make the connections with the Hebrew scriptures and just set a foundation so, we're not groping around blindly for the meaning of the text. And then from there, you can have a more freewheeling conversation, looking at the scripture a line at a time and getting people's reactions to it and talking about how it strikes people or applying it to your lives. But I do think if you have a freewheeling sort of a Bible study like that, it is important to ground it in a biblical or a theological resource that has some credibility and a little bit of expertise. Otherwise, you can really go off base and have people, frankly, teaching one another stuff that isn't quite accurately representative of what the scripture says or what the tradition of the church is. So one way to avoid that is to look at a commentary first, and Harper's is a really good one. We have a tiny church in Holly, Nebraska. It's the most remote parish in the whole Diocese of Nebraska. It's not in a town. It's in a place where there once was a town that's many, many miles from anywhere. And but they have an incredible book club and library. And it's a small, close-knit congregation, and they will together choose a book, and they will all read it within the course of 2 or 3 weeks. And then they get together and they have a conversation around it that's bounded by prayer and is understood to be Christian fellowship and formation for them. But they read very widely. And And then they put the books on a table down in the undercroft, and people who come visit, usually the bishop and the canon, buy them by the box full when they visit. That's pretty great formation and community building. I think it's critical for us to encounter the scriptures regularly somewhere in our lives. So if that's not happening for the folks you serve, I think that's the place you need to begin. But a book club is really accessible, easy stuff, and most Episcopalians are readers, and you can count on that. Couple of other things about education, again, unrelated. People often wonder about kids. If you have a couple of kids in your church, maybe a couple of young people or a couple of older youth, and you don't have the structure or the personnel to really offer meaningful church school, that would be the best thing. But so what do you do? So I would commend two things to you. I think that a priest or deacon, even in a small setting who's very part-time, can take responsibility for a preparation for confirmation when the time comes. And I think that's really important. And that can happen in a great range of ages. But the sort of traditional notion of youth who are old enough to really have an increasing awareness of adult faith issues and a capacity to make an adult profession of faith is appropriate. So probably no younger than early middle school, and ideally maybe you're talking high school kids. But you can read and meet and get to know and love a youth of that age as a deacon or a priest over the course of a couple months to prepare for confirmation in a way that's really wonderful for them and could be life-changing. And I feel like that's a responsibility of our clergy. I think the easiest way to include kids in the life of a small church and offer some kind of formation, if Sunday school is not possible, make them acolytes and find a way for them to help lead worship as best they can, given whatever their age and abilities are. There's so many ways to lift up a child or a young adult as an acolyte in the Episcopal Church. You can add all kinds of things to the service. They can carry anything. They can help in so many ways. You can get creative about that. But my experience has been that most youth sincerely want to be part of this, and they get frustrated when they don't feel included, when it feels like it's just not for them in any way. And if they're allowed to lead in that way and be trusted that they're sufficiently mature to contribute, they will usually rise to the occasion. Sometimes the squirmiest, orneriest kids turn out to be the very best acolytes. You just never know. Remember that the website of the larger Episcopal Church, whatever it is, episcopal.com, has every imaginable Christian education resource on it for free. You can go there and find Bible studies. You can go there and find retreat outlines. You can go there and find sermons. Like, it's all there. They've made, over the last many years, they have really made an effort to curate their library of education and formation resources. And they're well aware that they don't serve principally giant churches with big staffs who have fancy theological educations and are ready to be professors of teaching religion in churches. They know who they serve, and there's just a lot of great material to be found there. So don't forget that. And then finally, I'm still a huge believer when it comes to formation in accountability groups. But I will say that that's proven to be a really hard sell over the 10 years now that I've served as bishop here in Nebraska. I'm part of a colleague group, which I'll talk about later, but there are a couple of really key curriculums, including the Way of Love curriculum that probably you all have heard about, that has emanated from our current presiding bishop and his staff, that are about gathering in a small group, praying together, looking closely at the teachings of Jesus and the principles of discipleship into which we're all invited as his followers, and then really holding one another accountable to doing well by those disciplines. Like, that's a powerful way to increase and practice your faith. And I imagined when I first came here that would really work in a small church, because my experiences of our small congregations were that people really knew one another and they really loved one another and they were fiercely devoted to their churches. And I thought, boy, if we could just get a little bit organized around prayer and accountability, we could really leverage the great strengths of our small churches to go even deeper. And people have been super resistant to participating in those kinds of groups here. So I haven't given up. And when I've been able to lead them in a parish setting, that has been, by and large, a welcome addition to parish life, especially for folks who really feel called to it and enjoy it. It's been hard to sell as a bishop, and I'm not sure I fully understand why, but that's the case. I'll quit there with my thoughts about education. What ideas or questions do you all have? Carol.
Hi. I'm going to try to talk without losing my voice. I have a few questions. So I'm so on point with you. Like, I agree with everything of what you've just talked about. And it just makes my heart pitter patter how you've talked about education. But a few things I would like to ask some questions for. In your diocese, what have you seen about adult formation and people actually knowing how to use the BCP and being very fluid and understanding, and it's quick for them? Number two, what have you seen? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I am getting better from strep and pneumonia. Evangelism and discipleship. How have you tackled this in your diocese? What type of education do you have for your parish? Because I really do believe that if we're really going to redefine what evangelism is, that we need to start with our parishes first and get them all in and understanding it. So I wonder, have you done anything in your diocese for this already? And I'm just would love to hear what you were doing, if you are.
I'll love those questions. I'll do the best I can. I don't know that there's anything better in terms of being shaped by the Book of Common Prayer and sort of really equipped with its use and content than just using it. Like I didn't even know there was such a thing as Compline until I'd been a churchgoer for years and years. I was on an adult retreat headed to seminary before I'd ever seen that in my life. And of course, like the first time I heard it, I was totally transported and enchanted. And now a couple of my favorite prayers of all time are in there, but I just never seen it. So as deacons and priests who are leading in the parish, you all have some pretty great exposure at this point to the Book of Common Prayer, and you have access to it probably at your bedside. So I think becoming familiar and that's just constantly using it as your go-to resource for leading worship, for answering questions from the catechism, attention to rubrics and the calendar and all the rest. If you know that and can just share it by immersion and exposure, I really think that's the best way. I guess also making sure it's in people's hands, because it is a really useful tool, and it's not very expensive, and most of our churches have bazillions of them that aren't used much. So make sure everybody just takes one home and has it at home too. That'd help. But those are a couple of ideas about that. I was going to talk about evangelism next, but I will say, Carol, that I'm going to be really honest. I think for most Episcopalians, there's not a ton of evangelical fervor, principally because what we believe about heaven and hell is quite a bit more nuanced than a lot of Christianity. So if we don't, most Episcopalians simply don't believe that the God as we understand God being good, gracious, and ultimately forgiving could condemn anybody to a lifetime in hell. Now, some of you may believe that, and that's perfectly orthodox, but most Episcopalians don't. And the truth is that a lot of the fervor behind some of the best evangelists that are out there is a desire to save people from an eternity in hell. And we don't have that. What we're selling is abundant life and community that transforms human lives and that promises an encounter with the living God that will change you and shape you and challenge you for the rest of your life. But we probably aren't as effective selling fire insurance. And I think that means in some ways we're not as good evangelists as some folks in other denominations, if I'm being super honest.
But don't you think that's even better? Because of what we believe, it gives people the hope that there is something so much better than what they are doing right now. Like we do have a lot to give in evangelism, more so than evangelical traditions.
Well, I think
and so, you know, with that being said, I think that this is the time for us to be very excited about the opportunity of spreading that good news to people. That's not fire insurance. It's instead of insurance, it is a way of life, of joy and love and grace that we all need. Anyway, I'm so sorry. I'm just
preach. No, you're doing awesome. By a segue from here to like some of the thoughts I had about evangelism, we had a newcomers panel at our annual council. That's what we call our convention, about a month ago. And my colleague Liz Easton, our canon of the ordinary, found about a half a dozen Episcopalians who were all young adults who had come to the church in the last 2 years, and they were from various parts of the state. And they sat on this newcomers panel. And one of the really cool things that we learned is that people know about the Episcopal Church out there. And every single one of these people came to the Episcopal Church from some other religious tradition where they had come up against just too much hypocrisy. And they were looking for something that they felt was more consonant with the teachings of Jesus and his person as they had understood him in the Bible and their hopes for their own lives. And they knew about our progressive theology, and they knew about our orientation in terms of service and inclusion. And they knew our reputation of being an ancient liturgy that really celebrated the best of 2,000 years of inherited apostolic tradition. And so they came and we delivered. So the great news about that panel was that who we are is super appealing to people who are inquiring or searching, at least some, including Carol and everybody, the kind of stuff you were just celebrating, the grace, the inclusion, the genuine love, our efforts to really live lives of great integrity and faith, acknowledging that we're imperfect and our communities will always be a little bit broken, but we do have something really extraordinary to share with everybody else. Let me talk about evangelism a little bit in terms of trying to connect with the larger community and invite people into your churches and get them to stay. So I already named one thing, but one way to invite people into Sunday morning worship is to actually give them a job. Invite people to preach, invite people to come be musicians, invite people to come teach you something, expose them to the wonder of your Episcopal congregation that we were just talking about. And some will return. At the very least, they'll say nice things about us in the larger community, which helps keep us on the map. If you're in a smaller or medium-sized town, get articles in your newspaper. Most small town newspapers are dying for content. And if you offer a well-written piece of news or a promotion that has some artwork or photography attached, it's pretty close to certain that a small town newspaper will publish it. As an example, anytime the bishop visits, you could write a little note that says the bishop's going to be visiting town. Here's the bishop's story. They'll be confirming people. You know, it's something that happens once a year. And in a little town where there's a paper once a week and a goofy police blotter that everybody loves, that kind of story is delightful to look at and is going to get some attention. Getting yourselves into the larger community, of course, is its own kind of evangelism. And there are a couple of things that are obvious. One was already lifted up earlier, like the idea of the Veterans Day celebration, but there are lots of civic occasions where a religious presence is still welcomed by way of opening prayer or a closing prayer or some kind of remarks. When I lived in New York, I was in a town that was greatly impacted by the terrorist attacks of September 11th, as most were. And there was an annual celebration of that event. And I quickly became a person who the organizers knew they could count on for some sort of meaningful, inclusive prayers around that occasion, which was mostly not a religious service. But that totally helped put our little church on the map and put this, the parish priest before the little town. So that helped a lot. But equally, visiting convalescent homes is a huge one. Convalescent homes are notoriously underserved in terms of pastoral care and visitation of any kind. And if a deacon or priest is willing to go offer a simple religious service of any kind, whether communion under special circumstances or an actual Eucharistic celebration if you're a priest, or some sort of version of morning prayer or noonday prayer, that's almost always going to be well received by a local spot. And even if you only go once a month or once every 2 months, that's a nice way to serve and to raise your profile in the community. Honestly, a huge piece of evangelism, I think, is to write letters. So if you read about somebody in your local paper who did a really cool thing, write them a note and say you read this beautiful story about them and you're really proud, and that's what a neat thing it was that they did. Or if you see a performance by the high school kids who do the play once a year, write a letter to their teacher, their director, telling them how great the thing was. And, or if somebody offers some kindness to you in a local shop, write a letter to the paper and say, I had the most wonderful experience at Casey's. I had a flat tire and the clerk took the time to help me figure it out, whatever it was. If your name as a cleric is attached to that kind of happy news, which is easily done in your spare time, it really makes a neat impression on the community. It's really important for your website and your voicemail to be up to date. Don't feel like you have to have a website that has a whole bunch of stuff going on. It just has to have clear ways to connect with the church. Here's the phone number. Here's what time we worship. Put some pictures up so people will know what building to look for and what kind of congregation there's going to be. That's good enough. I mean, if you've got the talent to do a lot more, that's awesome. But I think we waste a lot of money and a lot of time trying to constantly perfect websites when really it's what people use instead of the phone book. And the information that is essential is just connecting information that doesn't need to be constantly updated. Voicemail, same way. That ought to be clearly indicate what time worship services are and how the priest can be located if there's an emergency. And I'll say that potential priests, this is not a place to be super boundaried. Yeah, it can be inconvenient and off-putting to get calls from people who aren't necessarily attached to the church and call hoping to get help and get the number of your cell phone and call you up. But that's part of the deal. Those are precisely the people that were invited to serve as the church. And those kinds of calls actually don't come all that often. And if you can't help, it's okay to say so. But refusing to be available to strangers in need is not good pastoring. That's, in fact, part of the job. So it's appropriate to publish a cell phone number, for instance, on a church answering machine. Celebrate everything and invite people. So this can be in and out of church. And an example I thought of in a small Nebraska church, at the beginning of hunting season every year, our Bitsy church in Hyannis, Nebraska does a big like feast for hunters. And they, at this point, they all know, this would be deer hunters in that part of the state, and they all know that they can come to this little church and just have a super fun feast and fellowship on that first night of deer season. And it's just a great celebration. The parish loves doing it because it's become such a community thing. They have lots of help now. But I'm sure there are all kinds of local occasions that might be celebrated that you can be part of as a church community. That's kind of all I've got in terms of evangelism, in terms of a sense of exposing yourselves to the larger community and raising the profile of yourselves as pastors or the church. Any other thoughts or ideas about evangelism or questions? I haven't looked at the chat. I'll do that too.
I think as one kind of mechanical suggestion in terms of accessibility and contact, our church had participated in a Thanksgiving dinner, and Mother Casey Rolliter, my rector, suggested that I volunteered to be the contact for reservations. She suggested I get what's it called, Google Voice phone number. So it looks like a regular phone, but it doesn't directly ring to my phone, but it collects emails, collects voicemails. So it worked pretty well as an intermediate between a real phone number and nothing. So,
John, that's a great idea. And certainly, even if you're opposed to Google, many are, you can always screen your calls. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can hear the message, you can respond at a time and in a way that's appropriate to what you can handle. What I want to argue against is making it impossible for people to connect to you who aren't insiders. That's when we've got a problem. And I see, I agree that the word evangelism has a lot of baggage attached to it at this point. And that may be a hard word for a lot of Episcopalians to deal with. So that's absolutely a fair critique. Let me say so. Oh yeah, Carol.
I have one more question. Okay, I have a couple. One, when we are talking about, you talked about like preparation for confirmation, you talked about some small groups, and then of course we talked about some evangelism, you talked about some volunteers and then also celebrating a lot. So with all that being said, I wonder what happens in your diocese with millennials and Gen Zers. Like, how do you reach out to them? How do you welcome them in? How do you equip them? Is any of that happening? These are just things on my mind. I'm sorry.
No, that's a great question. And to be honest, the diocese doesn't do anything for that group in any kind of organized fashion. It's all parish level right now, with the exception of the fact that we underwrite campus ministry work at UNO and at UNL here in Nebraska. But we don't have much that's organized at a diocesan level for young adults. And I would guess that's true in many of your places. That's partly about the dispersion of the diocese. You know, it's with 77,000 square miles in Nebraska, it's hard to do anything that's for everybody. So a lot of the most important work happens at the parish level just because of the scale of the place. I do believe in generational theory. I think there's a lot of wisdom behind the perceived differences of these groups and the challenges they're dealing with. I do believe my own kids would be millennials, and I've been marginally successful in terms of connecting them to Christianity, which is a little heartbreaking for me because I think their experience of life in the church growing up was just as beautiful as could be imagined. They were known and cherished and participated in really beautiful formation and outreach work, and they were in great diverse churches. Like the fact that they didn't both become priests floors me. I couldn't have tried harder, and their mom too. But they are making their own way, and they have hypocrisy antenna that are so finely tuned, and so that an awful lot of what they see Christianity represented as in the larger culture offends them greatly, and they don't want to be associated with it, even though the Episcopal Church is different. But they also won't let us off the hook. So if our liturgy isn't sufficiently inclusive of in terms of how we refer to humankind or different genders and sexualities, or all the issues that they have the passion and care about, if the church isn't right on it, they are tough judges. So that is a real challenge for us. I'm the only other thing I'd say, I'm just totally shooting from the hip here. I've been out of parish ministry for so long now. I do know that if getting those groups together is a huge help. So if you have even a small critical mass of people who are in a similar spot in life, whether young parents or moms or Gen Xers or millennials, whatever, it's often helpful to gather a group of folks who are at a similar place on life's timeline together and offer something. It could be a meal to get going, and how could your church serve you, or maybe some sort of formation. But I think it's a keen question.
Thank you. I think that's all fair. Thank you.
Looks like there's a great note in the chats about evangelism with integrity and a curriculum by Whitney Rice. Thank you.
So we took a class, there's several of us on here that took a class of contemporary missions.
That's where that's from. Awesome.
Oh, we all took a class of contemporary missions back in November. Several of us on here, not all of us. Reverend Canon Whitney Rice from Eastern Missouri, and that's where I'm from, is the Eastern Diocese of Missouri. Definitely starting of like a redefining evangelism, and it's all about spiritual integrity, and it's, pardon my pun, but it is off the chain. It's really great. We're definitely really working on it right now in all of our parishes here in Eastern Missouri. But I'm really seeing that the parish, I know the two parishes that I'm serving in at the moment, our parishes need to be on board first. Our parishes need to learn this. Our parishes need to be comfortable with this. This needs to be second nature for them first before we take it out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so that's why I asked you that question. And, like, what are you doing? Because we're really seeing a lot of, it's going to be slow. Let's just say that. It's going to be a little slow.
Let me see if I can whip through pastoral care and stewardship in the 15 minutes we have left. Nobody told me how to do a hospital visitation before I became a priest, and that's a pretty central part of the ministry. So here's what I would suggest you do. It's very powerful to go pray with people right before a hospital visit or a surgery, and including on the morning of, if that's possible, and it still is in most contexts. And your simple ministry of presence and appearance at a moment like that says a ton. You don't need to feel compelled to do a lot of teaching or counseling or anything like that. Show up, ask folks how they're feeling, say a sincere prayer, promise you'll check in and stay in touch later in the day. That's great. Even if you have more time and space, you needn't necessarily do more. If it's not and a hospital visit for me, if I am visiting people who are there for a while. So I might try to go every other day if somebody's on an extended hospital visit. I don't think you necessarily need to go every day. Great if you've got the time. Don't feel guilty if you don't. Maybe go every other day. Ask how they're doing. You don't need to focus on the medical issues. That they've got teams of people who are asking those questions and wondering about those things. Ask about their feelings. Ask what they're scared of. Ask how their family's doing. Find out about that person inside, and then offer a simple prayer. And if you pick up fears or hopes or concerns in your conversation prior, that might very well be part of what you pray for. And I learned early on from a wise priest, far more experienced than I always end hospital prayers with, at the last, welcome them into the joy of your heavenly kingdom. Because the truth is that we're all mortal, and that everybody's greatest fear in the hospital, and often a reasonable one, is that they won't leave. You're going to die. And it's appropriate and comforting to pray for healing and hope and to be very positive in a prayer, but it's also appropriate for a Christian pastor to acknowledge that at the last, there's still hope, and life will go on. And it just feels to me like an incredibly important referent, especially in that moment. Let's see. If you live in a small town, folks have to go far away to get hospital care. So if you can pray with them in their home before they depart by car, that's great. And definitely call the bishop or a clergy person you know in the town where the hospital is and ask if they'll look in on your folks who are there when you can't. Most priests or deacons would be delighted to drop in occasionally on somebody who's hospitalized for a while. This happens in Omaha all the time because we're a big regional hub, and we do lots of visiting of people who are hospitalized here from small towns, and it's a delight. And we will always say, Mother Stephanie from Kearney sent us, and that's why we're here. You know, she gets credit. We're all part of one church, but she's your pastor, and that's why we're here. I think for home communion visits, even if you're a priest, the best thing to do is still to use the communion under special circumstances service that is on page 396 in the prayer book. That's also great for deacons too. That is a lovely bunch of prayers, most of which you all will be familiar with. You take the reserved sacrament from church, and you have a nice visit with folks, and you find out how they're doing, and then you say, after maybe half an hour, doesn't need to be a big long visit, shall we share communion? And then they will say, of course, can't wait. And in the middle of that spot, there's a place for prayers, and you can pray for people's hopes and concerns that maybe you heard about it in your conversation with them. And then you can scoot off. Super long pastoral visits are by and large a hardship on people. There are other ways to have social and meaningful ways to touch base, but if you're bringing communion to folks in their home, that's a 30 or 40 minute trip, and that's ample. Here's what to say when somebody dies. I am so sorry for your loss. I can't imagine how you feel. Is there anything I can do to help? Nobody told me that either. You can count on a lifetime of exposure to the church's teachings about death, dying, and eternal life. That you don't have to, it's not a moment when you have to do a lot of teaching. People need to know that you feel for them. And try to resist the temptation to imagine you do know how they feel just because you too have experienced death in your life. Everybody receives the loss of a loved one in a different way. You don't know how they feel, no matter how similar an experience you might have been through. So it's really helpful to say, I can't imagine how you feel. And if they need to talk about that, they will. You can be an opening for that. just a little story about pastoral care. We have a brand new priest in North Platte, and he just reported he was so delighted that last week he had time to go to a basketball game where the one high school youth in that church happened to be playing. Now, that's a little bit above and beyond, but I'm here to tell you that his presence at that basketball game where he was seen by that kid and so honored what is one of the most important things in his life was not only really extraordinary pastoral care, but that was evangelism of a sort too. And so I would really commend to those of you who are in small towns, especially, thinking about that kind of connecting with the community and the things that folks in your congregation are doing in the community as pastoral care and evangelism. Write thank you notes. It's like the pure gold of pastoral care. And I cannot tell you how many people don't write thank you notes. As a bishop, you get to give a lot of wonderful gifts. I'm astonished at my clergy for failing to recognize when they get some pretty extraordinary gifts. So like, let's turn it the other way. Thank you notes they're like a vanishing thing. And it's such a nice opportunity to connect with people, to offer a word of kindness and support. You can often offer a theological truth. I really felt like it was almost like God cared for me when you did this nice thing for me. Like that is a very powerful, very simple thing to do. And a handwritten letter is way more valuable than an email. Email's not bad, but probably you're not so busy that you can't spend the extra 5 minutes to do a handwritten thing. And I would urge you to do lots of that. One phenomenally successful and faithful priest in the larger Episcopal Church by the name of Mark Anschutz made it a discipline to write 3 thank you notes every single day at the start of his day. And I wouldn't say that's the only reason he flourished as a pastor, but I know it made a really big difference. That's just a really cool thing to do in terms of pastoral care. And then finally, this is a hard skill it's one of those things they can't teach in seminary, but be nice and unselfish. Successful, faithful priests and deacons aren't jerks. You got to control your temper. You gotta be kind to people and expect the best of them. You got to take interest in their lives. You got to be unselfish in conversation. Don't always interject with a topper story. Keep asking questions about them. Hear their stories. You've got friends that you can tell your stories to. When you're interacting with the people of God, like, let them know that you care about them. Hear their stuff. Celebrate their stories. I'll quit there about pastoral care. You can tell now I'm just griping now. I'll talk about stewardship last. Let's see, Shane, your hand is up.
Yes, Bishop. Thank you. It occurred to me that I'm nicer when I take care of myself and my own spiritual health, when I provide self-pastoral care. And can you address how maybe important that is for clergy to maybe have a spiritual director and to take regular retreats and to spend time?
Well, yeah, God bless you. I had a bonus section that was caring your soul. So I'll quickly do that right now because we're out of time. So, gosh, yes, you're absolutely right. If you're not healthy and happy and grounded in your relationship with Jesus and in the support structures of the church, it's going to be really hard to do this work joyfully and to endure in it. So pray every day in whatever way works for you, but don't fake it. Gosh, that's hard discipline even for clergy. And I will confess that I went through a significant portion of my life as a priest without a regular prayer discipline. And in time, that will just wear you down. You got to find a way, whether it's centering prayer or reading the offices from the prayer book or any other devotional that works for you. Doesn't matter what time of day. Doesn't just find the way that works for you, and let that be part of the foundation the life of your spirit and self-care. And encountering scripture ideally would be part of that. Whatever way you find to pray that works for you, make sure that regularly hearing and thinking of studying scripture is a part of it. I've been part of a colleague group since very early in my ministry, and I super commend that to all of you. And at BKSM can provide that for you if you wish. You're all part of a cohort as students at BKSM that you've come to know and probably love, and you're in a very similar ministry context. And my colleague group meets in person twice a year. We happen to be folks from all over the nation, and we actually travel and meet for 3 nights. But we did that. We've done it for over 20 years now, and I can't tell you what the accountability of that group, the depths of relationship have done for us. We've had deaths, we've had divorces, we've had all kinds of issues with kids. We've had incredible changes and chances in ministry. And to have a place where you know you're known and loved and can let your shadow show a little and not be at risk is just immensely valuable. So I would really commend to you the possibility of finding people who you feel like you could trust and get to know and go the distance with in a colleague group. Spiritual direction, I agree, is essential, and probably therapy for most of us, and at least occasionally in the times of life when you get stuck. But I'm in regular spiritual direction and have been really over the course of my entire ministry. Sometimes that's weekly, more often it's monthly, kind of depends on what I need. But it's a lot of the same stuff. It's a place where you can be safe. It's incredibly helpful to be in spiritual direction when you're discerning something, because in the life of the parish and even in your family, everybody's got agendas, and your a good spiritual director doesn't. Their agenda for you is to seek out what the Spirit wants for your life and to help you figure that out. I would remind you all that continuing education, you don't need to worry about that now because you're immersed in an educational community, but in no time at all, you won't be. And that's actually required of our clergy. And there's all kinds of great continuing ed out there if you just get yourselves on some list and watch what your diocese is publishing in terms of opportunities. But a couple of things a year to keep your sword sharp and your brain and mind engaged seems really important to me. And especially if this job is starting to really get you down or feel too tough, don't be afraid to reach out. Most of the really serious trouble I've seen from our clerics begins with people in isolation who just wear out and or in some other way are not at their best, and then they get in trouble because of a boundary violation or something. So trust your bishop to have your back and call them up, or get yourself with a therapist, or re-engage with a spiritual director. But don't be afraid to ask for help. We all have periods in our lives, in our ministries, that are overwhelming. And if you try to go it alone, you're likely to encounter trouble. You know, I'll skip stewardship, but it's something I love to talk about. And if you all want to, I'd love to circle back, or you can write me an email and I'll tell you more. But I know we're out of time, and I want to respect that. Do remember that if you're a priest, you are running a small business, and that's a fun thing. That's part of the deal, and it's your obligation to take that seriously. You can't imagine that the lay people do all that work and you don't have to worry about the money. But you do. That's just part of the job.
Yep.
And I urge you to remember that, you know, tithing, giving generously, really abandoning our wealth to God is another one of those places where Jesus says, you'll meet me if you do this. And that's hard work. It's a journey for all of us. It takes time and commitment and a ton of negotiation with spouses if you've got one and all the rest. But I can testify that in my own life, as I've made that journey and have gone there and beyond, it has certainly strengthened my reliance on God in my life. It has advanced my relationship with Jesus. It's made me a way more authentic and passionate preacher when it comes to sharing generously and giving generously. And I really commend that to you. So I got no minutes left, but let me say, when it comes to your bishop, share good news. Don't just call when something crappy's happening. Please call when something great happens, because almost all we deal with is the crappy stuff. And it's so delightful to hear from somebody that's something wonderful. Please do a job or two for your bishop. Everybody's stressed. Churches are getting smaller. It's so hard to fill all the offices and commissions and committees. But think of an area where you'd have some fun, or just are willing to make a sacrifice and do a thing to support your diocese and the Episcopal ministry of the larger church. If your bishop calls, respond quickly. You don't have to treat it like it's an emergency, but I guarantee you that they don't. We're all awfully busy, and we're not goofing around. We're calling for a reason. Respond to the email, call back. You should do that really for anybody, but definitely do it for your bishop. And come to ordinations and funerals. You can't imagine. It's one of the most powerful witnesses we have of our community as clerics, and it's so deeply meaningful to have a full complement of priests and deacons present at those huge celebrations of life and ministry. I just can't tell you how important that is. It's one of the chief ways that you can show your commitment to the church and to your sisters and brothers in this work. So show up. I've gone way over time. You are the most kind,
we started late.
Small group of students. It's a treat to be with you. Thank you.
I really feel like we've received a lot of wisdom and a lot of things to think further about tonight. So thank you so much for this rich time together.
I mean it. Reach out to me by email or phone if you have any questions.
Very much.
And thanks for all you're giving and all you're doing. I can't wait to work with you all in the years to come. I plan to be here a long time, so I'll see you soon.
Hallelujah. We always close with comment. If you have time to stay for a few minutes, Bishop.